Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Brace for Changing Times. My name is Natalie Varanya, and I am the marketing specialist here at TalentMap, and I'll be your webinar moderator today. I am here with today's presenters. We have a special guest, Sharlyn Lauby. Sharlyn is an author, writer, speaker, and consultant. She has been named a top HR digital influencer and is best known for her work on the HR Bartender blog. HR Bartender has been recognized as one of the top 5 blogs read by HR professionals by the Society for Human Resource Management. Also joining us is Sean Fitzpatrick, founder and CEO of TalentMap. Sean has worked with organizations of all sizes across multiple sectors, which gives him unique insight about how organizations can improve as they grow. In addition to leading TalentMap, Sean serves on the board of directors for the Canadian Advanced Technology Alliance, has authored several papers on measurement in the workplace, and is widely sought for HR speaking engagements across North America. So for those of you who aren't familiar with TalentMap, we are a full-service employee engagement survey provider. We ensure our clients ask the right questions, analyze the data, and most importantly, act on those results. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sean and Sharlyn. Over to you, Sharlyn.
Thanks so much, Natalie, and thanks everyone for listening in. And I'm really looking forward to having a conversation amongst colleagues about the subject of employee engagement and digitization. When Sean and I started talking about putting this together, we sat down and were saying to ourselves, you know, what are some of the key things that we think people want to talk about or that they're thinking about from an organizational perspective when it comes to digital transformation and employee engagement. And so these were sort of these questions that you're seeing right now are the questions that we used and sort of challenged ourselves with as we were putting today together for you. It talked about the key issues, redefining the workplace, and what is the concept of employee engagement. And Sean's going to get a little bit more into that as we go forward. What might engagement look like in the years and the decades ahead? I know sometimes we're so focused on the here and now that we don't get an opportunity to really sit back and say, what do we think these processes or what do we think concepts are going to look like in the months and years to come? What does employee engagement and digital transformation mean for different business sectors? Is it possible that some of the conversation that we're going to be talking about changes based upon business sector, or that it changes based upon certain skill sets? How can your organization prepare for digital change? And I know that for many of us, we've been feeling the effects of digital change. So what can we do to prepare and go forward? And then finally, how can employee engagement solutions help your organization achieve your goals? So to get us started, I have to admit, whenever I'm faced with sort of sitting down and thinking, you know, just really spending some focused time thinking on, well, what do I think is happening now and what do I think is happening in the future? One of the things that I do, the first thing that I do is I pull out the dictionary because I want to make sure that I'm talking about the right concepts, or I'm using words in a correct way. And I know we have a tendency to use words interchangeably, and that's fine. But I thought to sort of set up the conversation that we're having today, it would be great to dive into a little bit about what digitization means versus digital transformation. And so digitization means creating a digital version of a physical thing. It doesn't eliminate the physical item, and many of us have experienced or created digitization. Probably the most famous thing that I can think of right now is if you read the news recently, Stephen Hawking's doctoral thesis was put out on the internet. I think it actually crashed a few sites at the same time, but digitization is that whole idea of making a digital version of a physical thing. Now that's a little bit different than digital transformation, which sometimes you hear as digitalization. And that's improving or enhancing a process by leveraging technology. So it's taking technology and making something better. And it's possible that digital transformation involves digitization, but it doesn't necessarily have to. And a great example would be adding technology to a process, maybe like employee engagement, since that's the conversation we're going to have today, in order to transform it and take it to the next level. Now, when we think about digital transformation, let's talk a little bit about where digital transformation is right now. The current state of digital transformation is that 45% of small and medium-sized businesses believe that having a digital presence is important for their business. 77% believe that a digital presence helps with customer acquisition, and 55% of organizations acknowledge that there is a digital talent gap. You're hearing about the digital divide, and that it's having an impact on business, particularly in the areas of customer service and learning and change, where we're seeing a lot of processes become digital. And do our employees have the skills and abilities in order to use these digital solutions to service customers and to create their own learning? But one of the things that I think is so interesting is when you just look at these three statistics that we've put out here, and we're talking about digital transformation, if it's important to business and it's important to getting customers, which we all know that getting customers is the key to, marketing and sales and bottom line profits and all of those things that we need in order to be competitive, then we have to think about digital transformation and also employee engagement, because employees are the people who help us get the work done, which I think is a great setup to let Sean sort of take the other side of this equation and talk a little bit about what employee engagement means. So I'll turn it over to Sean.
Good. Thank you, Sharlyn, and thanks for the opportunity to discuss a little bit with the audience here today about what we do and what some of the trends that we're seeing in the workplace. I think Sharlyn started off on the right note. I think it's really important to define what exactly you're looking at or talking about, because there is a lot of misunderstanding around a range of different terms out there. But employee engagement is probably one of them that has a lot of misunderstanding. In fact, employee engagement can mean very different things to different organizations and to different people in the workplace. It's something that needs to be well defined and well understood for it to be measured and then for it to be improved. And that's probably one of the larger gaps that a lot of organizations have, is a real lack of understanding on the definition of engagement. One of the, an interesting study we put out is we looked at the percentage of organizations that actually had a written, defined definition for employee engagement. And these organizations were measuring engagement. So they're just across the board. It was a broad study of what's out there. And what we found was less than 20% of the organization, so about 1 in 5, actually could produce a written definition of how they define engagement in the organization. And even more telling, of those 20% of organizations, only about half of them felt that their managers and executives understood or partially understood the definition. So it's interesting that a lot of organizations have been talking about engagement. You hear it written about, spoken about, measured all the time. And it's very interesting that a lot of organizations still haven't sat down and go, what does it really mean? And why I talk about that is because engagement can have so many different facets. You can be engaged in a particular job or task, but not necessarily engaged in an organization. or conversely, you can be engaged in an organization and not engaged in the job or task all that much. So engagement can have different focal points. It could be on the job or work, it could be on the organization, it could be on the team. So understanding those nuances within your organization starts to get very important as you're trying to understand how to improve it, because if you want to understand what do you want your employees engaged in. I put a definition up here. It's TalentMap's definition. I think it's always good to have something to start with to get a sense of what we're doing and how we approach it. If organizations don't have an engagement definition, I encourage them to use something like this. If they do, I encourage them to make sure it's written down and shared with the managers and executives, and over time, shared and taught to what it means to employees. Because you want employees to be engaged, but they often don't even know what you mean by that term. So defining it, writing it down, and communicating it is very critical. At the bottom of this, you'll see sort of three components, this concept of how people are connected logically, how they're connected emotionally, and the behavioral output that comes from that. Those broad principles, those three principles, are consistent in almost every definition you should see out there on work, task, organizational, or employee engagement. So and that comes from evidence and academic research as to what the underlying pinning of the concept of engagement is. It's how people connect logically to their job or their organization, and also how they connect emotionally. And if you get those two pieces right, then you're going to get that extra effort, that ambassador, the person that's willing to go the extra mile. The last point I want to make about the definition is it is an investment of personal energy. You'll notice that up there in green. Why I say it's personal energy, because really in today's workplace, most organizations are knowledge-based organizations. The jobs of leaders and managers and HR is often just to create an environment where people can then choose, hopefully the right choice, to actually invest their own personal energy into their job, into working with the team, into working with customers, into coordinating and collaborating with others. Or if it's not the right environment, they will choose to withhold that personal energy. So it's very much understanding how you tap into how people think and that energy that they bring to the job and the emotional energy they bring to the job. And that's why it's so important to understand the nuances of engagement and not just take whatever's given to you as gospel and work with that. So understanding your definition or writing it down and defining it is critical. I'm going to very quickly touch on the current state of engagement, and then we'll jump into some of the trends. Just, broadly speaking, lots of linkages between high levels of engagement and better business results. And I'm not going to go through the data on here and the stats. I'm assuming most of the audience on this call, on this webinar, will be familiar with a lot of these. And if you're not, you can email us and we can give you lots of evidence, both practitioner and academic work, on the linkages between employee engagement and a range of better business outcomes. Well, what I want to do before we jump into it is sort of point out a couple of things around engagement. And one of the challenges is we're not really improving a lot on engagement. We're spending lots of money. Latest estimate shows we're probably spending in North America close to $1 billion on employee engagement measurement and follow-up and action planning initiatives across all organizations. But engagement doesn't seem to be improving all that much. It's not going down, but it's not ramping up all that quickly. Here's a longitudinal study that TalentMap has been tracking since the early 2000s on employee engagement. And this is across all industries, all organizations, small and large, from 25 employees up to 100,000 employees in a range of different sectors. And what's so telling about this is there's very little variance or very little up and down. It's very constant. So engagement, even though we've been focused on it and spending money on it, we haven't really improved it a lot. And I think part of that is because we don't understand it that well. And part of it is because employees' expectations are changing and evolving and even raising. So just to give you some sense, as I wrap up here on this definition component, I really encourage organizations to step back and think, what is the engagement definition for our organization? What do we want our employee engaged in? Is it in innovation, in customer service? Do we want them engaged in the organization? Or do we want them engaged in a particular job or task? And that's really critical to us. So the context of your business determines what's really important. Just to give you some sense, even the academics don't agree on engagement. There's over 10 academic scales out there in published literature and well over 100 practitioner definitions and scales. So it is not an easy area to grasp, but what I'm encouraging clients to do is think about their definition and we start to write down if they don't have a written definition and use that as a basis for improvement. Sharlyn.
So the 5 trends that we want to spend some time talking about with you today are globalization, agility, career development, mobility, and wellness. And Sean, let's go ahead and dive right into the first trend, which is globalization. But before we do that, Natalie, I think this would be a great time to maybe do a quick poll. So while Natalie's queuing up the poll, we'd love for you to weigh in on, do you feel that we currently have a skills gap? So you can select the first response is yes, and your organization is feeling the impact of a skills gap, or yes, you feel that there's a skills gap, but you haven't really seen it impact your business just yet, but you're concerned about it maybe. And then the final one, no, you haven't seen a skills gap impact at all. You know, I have to say, while you guys are answering, I'll tell you that some of the research that I've been reading lately, you know, when we traditionally think about a skills gap, we have a tendency, I think, to automatically go to STEM, you know, the science, technology, engineering, math conversation. But I'm starting to see more conversation about there being what I would call maybe a leadership or a soft skills gap, a middle skills gap, where the skills that are that employers are having some challenges getting talent with revolve around things like supervisory skills and communication and those kinds of things. So that when we talk about the skills gap, I think one of the, it's not a formal trend, but one of the things that we might want to pay attention to is how organizations are defining skills gaps and what it means for their business. So,
and Sharlyn, on that, it's interesting in that there's different parts of the world where those, if you just looked at those soft skills or leadership skills and supervisory skills, are more acute than in other parts of the world. For example, in Asia, as areas are growing and organizations are growing very, very quickly, that's one of the biggest areas where they lack people is in leadership roles, supervisory roles, team roles, because the skills and management capability is not as developed, for example, as what you might see in Europe or North America.
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting. Those of you, if you want to pick up some current research on the skills gap, first of all, I would recommend 2 things. One, if you're on Twitter, there is a hashtag called skills gap, and I find it very interesting to go in on a regular basis and just check that out, because it kind of tells you what people are talking about in terms of the skills gap. So if you want to monitor that, you could save that hashtag and just check in on it every once in a while. The Association for Talent Development also has a public policy paper called Bridging the Skills Gap. And the thing that was interesting to me about this skills gap conversation was that they said 87% of survey respondents said that they saw a gap in business performance as a result of the skills gap. So this is CEOs sitting down saying, I'd love to take that piece of business, but I'm not sure that I have the talent in order to make it happen. Hey, Natalie, where are we as far as the poll goes?
Yeah, so a lot of people voted, and it looks like 70% are feeling the impact, definitely. 22% are, but it doesn't impact their business, and 7% have not seen the impact whatsoever.
So there you go. That kind of gives you some sense of what the people listening in today are thinking as far as that goes. And if you have any comments about the skills gap, go ahead and drop them in the chat, and we'd love to hear about them in the Q&A section at the very end. But when you're thinking about skills gaps, I think one of the big things that happens is we have a tendency from a talent acquisition perspective to cast a wider net. And that's where globalization comes into play. So we're talking about creating a global workforce strategy to bring in the best talent. And we have to think about multiple things when we're talking about putting together a global workforce strategy. Obviously, trade, and I know as much as we would like to say that politics and economics don't have anything to do with this, they really do, along with the availability of skilled workers. For our organizations, can we get the workers that we're looking for in order to move the business forward? And one of the things that I think is becoming a interesting addition to this conversation is the whole idea, if you don't have a corporate social responsibility initiative in your organization, thinking about how things that are happening in society are impacting business. For example, earlier this year, I had the opportunity to go to the Great Place to Work conference, and they had Fortune 100 CEOs sitting in a room talking about the fact that for years they've been, I guess, what's the right, politics agnostic. They wanted to, obviously they had laws that they would love to see passed and things like that, but that when it came to sort of going out there and putting their opinion out in the media, that they really refrained from doing that, and that given some of the things that are happening right now in the world, employees were going to the C-suite saying, you need to weigh in on this, you need to tell people how we are as an employer. So these kinds of things, your employees might be driving some of it, or what's happening in terms of talent acquisition and the skills gap might be driving some of it. But the bottom line is there are lots of different things that go into creating a global workforce strategy. On that note, I'm going to turn it over to Sean so he can talk a little bit more about some of those things.
Thanks, Sharlyn. One of the interesting things just around that corporate social responsibility is we've been asked for our clients more and more to actually create sections or items or dimensions to measure corporate social responsibility in the workplace. A good example is a retail chain based in Western Canada, and they have approximately 300 stores. And because of the nature of the business that they're in and the type of staff that they bring into their organizations, usually younger staff, corporate social responsibility is a very important aspect of the workplace. And in fact, what we found in some of the research is that it is not only important, for some stores in some regions, it was actually one of the drivers, one of the top 3 drivers of employee engagement. Now, it is not always, we don't always see that, but I thought that was very interesting. And more organizations are asking us to include a dimension on corporate social responsibility. About 4 or 5 questions we typically ask on it, and we can create an index and benchmark them against other similar organizations on those same corporate social responsibility index. So we're seeing it growing in the workplace as not only important to CEOs, but also important to get a measure around to understand how it's being perceived or used in the workplace.
Sean, if you don't mind, let me just jump in at this point in time for the people listening in on the call who are members of the Society for Human Resource Management, or you're familiar with the Society for Human Resource Management. Corporate social responsibility is a part of the HR competency model. So there's becoming a greater alignment, and Sean, you brought it up just a second ago, a greater alignment between corporate social responsibility and the work of human resources.
Yeah, interesting, good. The next thing, I just want to turn around because we're talking about globalization, and I want to now put the focus or lens a little bit back onto engagement and sort of look at it, because we do very much are fairly insular when we do focus on engagement in North America and Canada and the US. We assume it's worldwide, but it isn't necessarily worldwide. However, engagement is in high levels of interest in all of the developed countries and the developing countries. If you'll notice on this map, anything that's in blue, and in fact the dark blue, indicates level of interest. This is just off of Google Trends. Google Trends is a great little tool. You can go in there, do a search, and it'll actually show you which trends are searching, which terms are searching, being used a lot for searches, and where those searches are being found. So you'll notice what's interesting, there's a lot of interest in employee engagement in India. And in fact, it's one of the most popular countries where searches are coming out of. And you'd think, well, why would that be? And one of the things that's interesting about India, they have 1 billion people. It's not so much that they can't find people to do the work. They can't find people with the right skills to do their work. So when they do find people, and their economy is growing rapidly due to technology, when they do find people to do the work, they really want to keep them. And one of the ways that they're doing is through engagement initiatives, engagement plans, engagement action plans, engagement surveys, a whole range of tools. And that's because there is such a high demand for skilled workers in India that they need to, once they get them into place in the workplace, they want to keep them there. I wanted to show you a little bit too around changes in how engagement's viewed around the world. It's not all viewed the same way. This is just looking at fully engaged employees, high levels of engagement. And what's interesting in this map is you'll actually see, fairly high levels of engagement, Britain, Germany, France, Canada, but China, much, much higher, in almost at 20%. India, much higher, in at 20%. And, my first inclination when I would look at this, and you say, well, they must have much higher levels of engagement than other parts of the organization, which isn't necessarily true. What also you have to do when you're measuring things like engagement and this growing diversity in the workplace that we have is start to understand the cultural differences on how people from that culture typically view a concept like employee engagement. And they don't necessarily view it the same way that we might view it if we were born and raised in North America or Western Europe, for example. And I'll tell you some of the reasons why. There's sort of 5 main areas how you look at culture and how it can impact employee engagement. Sort of one of the biggest things is what they call power distance. And power distance is really the extent in which less powerful members of an organization accept that power is distributed unequally, meaning it's a much more hierarchical organization. I'm at the bottom of the totem pole, and the CEO is at the very top, and there's a large distance between me and him or her. As an example, where small power distance is much more flat organization. For example, China has a very high power distance, where the US and Britain, for example, have a much lower power distance. The same thing when you start to look at things like individualistic or collective. And individualistic societies tend to be much more focused on looking after themselves and their direct family, where collective society is really looking after how, as a group, we can take care of everybody and move things forward. And another good example is US tends to have a very individualistic society, very much the independent lone cowboy type of sort of mindset. Germany, on the other hand, is much more of a collective environment. That society is much more viewed as a group and working as a collective moving forward. So understanding engagement, it's not only looking at how the drivers might incur across and what the scores might be in the different regions, or if you have different segments within your organization, but start to understand the nuances of what causes those differences. And that's important because it starts to dictate what the drivers might be based on those scores. So the drivers in China, for example, or with Chinese nationals might be different than, for example, in the United Kingdom. So understanding how people see things like engagement is not universal. And the reason why it isn't universal is because of some of the aspects of their culture and upbringing and assumptions that they live and work in. In terms of, I just jumped, I thought this one was interesting. In the Chinese example, you'll notice that IT systems and support, a lot of the other ones are similar. Sense of personal accomplishment, those are both very important, and they're almost universal on engagement. China is a little more focused on pay fairly, benefits, more so than, for example, the United Kingdom. But IT systems and support and business needs is really critical, something that's not a driver in a lot of other Western organizations, but a good reputation for customer service is a driver. So they can not only vary by country in terms of order, but in terms of actual drivers can be very, very different. So understanding the definition and then where you're collecting this data, not a standard set of drivers will be universal across the board for all countries. Not only that, is understanding the nuances of each country determines how, and some of those examples that I talked to earlier might help you understand a little bit why they're viewed differently.
And that kind of leads us to trend number 2, which is about agility. And, when we think about the term agility, we think about that, fluidity, flexibility, and that applies in this particular case, but we're talking about what are called agile methodologies. And agile is a process used in software. It's an iterative approach to developing software. So what ends up happening is instead of tackling a big project, I guess the best way for me to put it out there is to say, instead of tackling a big project, that big project is broken down into small milestones or think of little projects within a big project. And it's introduced in phases for which there's a regular feedback session, and based upon that feedback, that takes you to the next step in the process. And, when we talked about globalization, we talked about getting the right people and bringing them into the organization. Agile to me represents a change in the way we do work. So for organizations using agile methodologies, not just in software development, but in other things as well, is a real change in the way that work gets done and can have an impact on engagement. And so I talked very little in this particular case, but I want to turn it back over to Sean because I think that he's got some thoughts on how it changes the way we work in an engaged workplace.
Yeah, Sharlyn, this one's a very interesting trend, this whole concept of agile environment or agile working. And I think it's born, you're right, out of the software world. And the reason why it came out of software, or at least started there, is because in software development, there are so many unknowns. So it is very difficult. The more traditional way of software development would be a waterfall method. At the beginning of the project, 6 months, a year, 2 years out, you would define what your requirements are, you'd lock in your requirements, and then you'd send it over to the software team. They would work on it for a year or 2 years, and then they would deliver the final product. And that sort of worked for many years, maybe a lot less now. I know in the federal government in Canada, the Phoenix pay system may not have been an agile development in that they're looking to scrap that whole system now because of maybe not getting consistent, regular feedback from people during the process. So this idea of agile is really built on the idea of there's so many unknowns in the world, and there's so many unknowns that we're going to run into in 3 months, 6 months, a year from now, that it's very hard to predict. There's so much variance in what's happening, not just in software, but in customer needs, in technology, and in the way we work. So this concept is now seeping into the workplace, and organizations are starting to not only apply it in the software or IT, but also to other aspects of the workplace. in terms of projects, marketing, operations, and thinking, how could we work more like an Agile philosophy? And the concept is really interesting. One of the things that they do, though, is they physically start to look at the workspace itself. So if you're going to look at an Agile approach, what you're going to start to do is one aspect is you look at your physical office. How many quiet zones do you have where people who are on mobile today moving around can actually work for a while without being interrupted? How much access to resources? What kind of open plan do they have? Do they have breakout rooms? All of these things, for example, are elements of a very effective physical layout, but there's so much more to Agile than just the physical space. It's really an approach or understanding of how things work in the workplace, and this iterative, constant feedback, regular feedback, making change, looking at how that change is being received, and then getting feedback again in very short cycles. It could be weekly cycles, 2-week cycles, monthly cycles, but in very, very quick cycles, not in 6 months, 12 months, or 18-month windows. And what's interesting, an interesting study out there looking at employees that work within the Agile environment were much more satisfied than a lot of other things. And the reason why is because there's some interesting things in an Agile environment. One of the things is employees tend to be a lot more productive. And productive employees generally are happy employees, engaged employees. Another interesting thing is quality tends to increase significantly. You can see a 29% increase in quality. And that is because the team that is delivering the product, whether it's a marketing product, an operation, software product, whatever delivery they're delivering, they're much more in tune with the customer or client or end user in regular feedback sessions. So the quality itself that gets delivered in the end of the day meets those requirements much more consistently than a traditional working method that we have, which is setting your goals, cascading those goals down. It's much more interactive. So high levels of engagement and satisfaction with Agile teams. Not only that, if you sort of look at what's happening just generally around, in this case, millennials versus non-millennials, and the amount of regular feedback that millennial employees want. When we look at what they want versus what traditional Xers and boomers want in terms of regularity, you'll notice the millennials in blue expect and want frequency of feedback much more frequent on a weekly basis, monthly basis, than, for example, traditionalist boomers and Xers that are okay with feedback on a much more annual or quarterly basis. So significant differences in terms of the expectation of getting feedback back to them. One of the best tools that we've seen that align with the Agile working environment are pulse surveys. We're seeing more and more clients using this in a way to get this concept of constant feedback or regular feedback, this idea of always-on engagement. One of the beautiful things about pulse surveys is it really allows you to raise up issues before they become real hot buttons within the organization. It gives organizations an ability to put areas or hot issues on the table and talk about those issues on an ongoing basis before they become a full-blown fire. It allows and it removes excuses for not acting on results because the managers, they're dated or those survey results are too old. By having pulse data on a regular basis, managers can't say, well, it's not relevant. It very much is relevant when they have on a pulse on a regular basis. There are some drawbacks to pulses. So, it's not a perfect scenario all the time, but it's a very effective process to align with this Agile concept. Lastly, I do want to just touch on, there's a range of different pulses out there. Probably the ones that mix in with Agile the best way are really around these last two, these audience or topic specific and follow-up surveys. So as they're running through the process, and also the snapshot pulses that are used most in terms of aligning with this Agile workforce and Agile philosophy that's out there.
Yes, The next trend that we're going to talk about is career development. And, Sean just was walking us through pulse surveys. And I think that when we start to talk about pulse surveys, one of the first things that pops into my mind is this whole concept of real-time development. And that is something that, when we talk about, digital and digital transformation, the idea of developing people on a regular basis all the time, is something to consider, because technology is changing the way that work is designed. We've kind of, in globalization, we talked about bringing the right people into the organization, and in our second trend, agility, we, talked about setting them up for success and, in terms of our processes. That means career pathing changes a little bit along the way. There is research out there that says, from Pew Research, that says 10,000 boomers will turn of retirement age every day for the next decade. So organizations do need to think about, while all of those people are not just up and quitting on the same day, they need to think about knowledge management, and they need to think about transitioning people out of the workplace. In addition, there's this dynamic of, you can call it the sharing economy or the gig economy, but that freelancing is going mainstream. And when we go back to some of the trends that we've already talked about, does freelancing play a role in career pathing? So, for example, when we're talking about boomers, is it possible that an individual can go from a regular full-time position to a part-time or a freelancing position as part of a planned exit strategy from the workplace? But almost 60 million people freelance, and 1.4 trillion to the US economy. So this is a group of people who are getting work done in a way that maybe we've not thought about before. And what does that mean for us as human resources professionals when we're putting together our workforce plans? And then finally, this last part that has to do with training and developing people, the whole concept of on-demand learning. Can I get, when I was growing up, and I'm old enough to admit this, when I was growing up, when I wanted to know something, my parents looked at me and said, hey, look that up in the encyclopedia, or look that up in the dictionary. And today, the way we find out things is we go on YouTube. So when we want to learn, I'll give you a personal example. I wanted to learn recently how to truss a chicken. And I was able to find very quickly and easily a video on YouTube that was like 1 minute long that told me how to truss a chicken. No big fancy way of doing things. Now that we're talking about digital transformation and engaging employees, and Sean has already mentioned a few times during our time together about how we create an engaged workplace, one of the ways that we might want to consider doing that is by having learning readily available for employees at the moment that they need it. We can also look at, these things don't have to be expensive. If you haven't had an opportunity to check out a MOOC, it's called a massive open online course. MOOCs are opportunities for employees to learn. Major universities all over offer MOOC courses. You can just do a quick search on the internet and you can find all of them out there. They are really very good. So when you're talking about giving employees skills that they might not currently have, MOOCs can be a terrific opportunity. A couple of years ago, I took one just because I wanted to see the quality of a MOOC. I took one on gamification, and it was an awesome course. But when we're talking about career pathing, and we're talking about employee engagement, it definitely has a crossover when we're talking about career development. And Sean, I know that you have some thoughts to add in this particular area.
Yeah, no, the whole idea of career pathing is interesting, because a lot of organizations we're seeing are not looking at just whenever you join an organization. You know, this is the more traditional, how do you make sure they're engaged? You know, how do you measure their performance, and you know, how do you develop them, and so on. So and that's really important, and continues to be very important. But what we're seeing also is more and more organizations starting to look at getting feedback from employees and through the whole life cycle, from the time that they join an organization to the time that they leave. And in fact, I'll give you an example. We've even worked with some organizations that are starting to look at not just what the onboarding process is like and what's working around the onboarding, where the gaps are, how do they fill them in, but also getting feedback from candidates that they put a job offer out to and the offer was rejected, or didn't even apply to the job. So got, you know, through career fairs or tracking people coming and going, and trying to understand why certain people are actually applying to certain roles and why others are not. And then based on that, thinking and honing around their message around recruitment. So we've used survey tools to be able to actually measure some of those components. One of them, for example, was that a large Canadian retailer based in Toronto. They attracted a lot of university and college students. They go to the career fairs on site and on college, but what they were finding is a lot of people that may start the application process were not finishing the application process. So what they were doing is, yeah, they were starting it and they were sort of realizing that this is not the place that they wanted to be. So they wanted to understand, why is it that those candidates were not continuing on? Were they not getting a good enough shot to do that? So we help them collect data there. Another example where organizations, for example, in the onboarding, we have tools like Talent Entry, where we're collecting data from employees as soon as they join an organization. Things like, you know, very basic. You have a phone, you have your business card, is your computer working? You know, all of those base, have you met your manager? Do you have your clear goals and objectives? These are questions that organizations are asking systematically within the first week or 2 weeks of joining the organization. One pharmaceutical company we worked with, what they found is employees would often not have email or computer set up for 10 to 15 business days after they join the organization. And part of the reason was, it wasn't IT's fault, because IT has a service level agreement to deliver the requisite within 15 days of it being delivered. What happens was, the managers were actually putting the requisite for the equipment in basically the day or two before the employee was being hired or start date. And these types of things we're able to understand, and then they were able to get on board employees and engage them quicker, train them quicker, help them with their career quicker, in a way that's changed and reduced the turnover of new employees. One other area that we're doing a lot of work on, given what Sharlyn was talking about, this 10,000 baby boomers turning of retirement age every day, is we're collecting more and more exit data. This is surveys from employees that are leaving the organization and using that data to backfill the knowledge that is walking out the door. So this area of ability to collect data when people are first joining the organization, during the organization, and when they leave the organization, and to actually track their engagement and career development through that whole life cycle, provides a real interesting insight for a lot of organizations, and we've developed some tools to be able to do that. TalentGate is one platform that allows our clients to measure not just engagement, but new hires, exits, pulses, 360s, all in one consistent platform. And a lot of clients find that valuable to be all in one spot at one time.
Which kind of leads us to our next trend that has to do with mobility. Now, this isn't mobile technology, although I think mobile technology is really important. What we're talking about here is the ability to service your workforce from anywhere. And Natalie, this is probably a great time to do our second poll. This particular poll has to do with whether or not your organization offers any kind of remote work option. You can select the first button, yes, and our employees love it, or yes, but we question the value, no, but we're considering it, Or the final one, no, it really doesn't fit with our culture. I know in my career, I've worked in some industries where the majority of the workforce would not have been in a position to do remote work, like for example, in the hospitality industry. But there were other places where a lot of employees were able to do remote work. I also know that right now, and you guys have probably seen it too, there's a lot of media attention being focused on organizations sort of calling back their workers to the office and doing a little bit less remote work. But I think that there are some value propositions to remote work that are worth discussion. Natalie, before we move over there, where are we with the poll? Oh, fantastic. Now we do have a little bit of, an even distribution where the others are concerned, but the vast majority say yes and employees love it. That's what I've always heard too. But for everyone else, yes, but we question the value. No, but we're considering it, or no, it really doesn't fit with your culture. I can see all of those as well. But let's talk a little bit about some of the value that you can get if you do bring remote work or create a remote work policy. Right now, there are surveys that show 50% of employees work remote at some point in time. That might be on one particular day of the week, or they might be just given the flexibility to work at home, or out of the office, depending upon what's going on. Maybe, something's happening. There are several workplace flexibility benefits. There's a school of thought that says if I don't have to get in the car and get on the highway, to go to work every day, that I might be more productive and I might be more efficient. There might be some lower stress levels if I, don't have to deal with, traffic and, a whole, running around and the clock and everything in the morning. That there are higher levels of engagement. And I'm going to let Sean sort of take the engagement conversation in just a second. But there are also a couple that maybe businesses haven't been quite as focused on in the past. One of them is decreased real estate expenses. If you have fewer people coming to work every day, you don't need as big of a building, or you don't need to rent as big of a floor. There's also some data that shows it's better for the environment. And we just had the conversation about people exiting the workforce. Remote work could be one of those things that if you're concerned about keeping people in the workforce just a little bit longer, giving workers the option of remote work might be a great transition for workers as part of their retirement strategy. And Sean, I didn't get a chance to cover engagement, so I'm going to go ahead and turn that over to you.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Sharlyn. Yeah. And just to reiterate a little bit about what Sharlyn is talking about is we expect a high percentage of the workforce, over 70%, will be considered mobile working or able to work in a mobile way. And a lot of them want to work from home just to escape interruptions. You often hear that when you're walking down the hall in your offices, I got to work from home. I got to get something done. This idea of it's a quieter place to work. And a lot of people actually think that they actually get more work done at home, a high percentage of them than not. So it's something that is very important to people and continues to grow as Sharlyn was talking about. What's interesting though is where organizations are at with respect to providing information in a mobile environment. And one of the things that's been good and bad about consumer technology, it's been great from a consumer point of view. We have access to everything. We can, order Amazon, through a app on our phone. It can be delivered to our office or our house the next day. We don't have to leave anywhere to go Christmas shopping. It is really good in terms of, and the usability of these apps are incredibly good. Millions of people are using them. It's transparent, it's open, it's easy to see. You can track your product. If you're ordering Uber or Lyft, you can track where your car is. All of that stuff has really been a real benefit for consumer. The downside for business is the expectation now of employees when they come into the workplace is that those same ease of use, those same consumer grade technology will be available in the workplace. And that's where we fall down. A lot of organizations just don't have that level of usability for the apps that employees should have access to within the workplace. A lot of the reason is because these are built on traditional business apps or enterprise apps are built on more legacy technology that are not well suited to the mobile environment. But what we found is access to company information definitely boosts employee engagement. If they have easy access and can do it, they're going to be a lot more productive, and it affects job satisfaction. 51 are more productive when accessing related materials through a mobile device. So having access has done two things. One is our expectation has gone up because of our experience outside of work, and employers have not been able to catch up yet. You know, a lot of them, like 41%, unable to access the company documents from their mobile device, either their iPad or tablet. In fact, 36% are having difficulty accessing documents outside the office. When we do our engagement surveys and culture surveys, one of the questions we ask or dimensions is around innovation. And you sort of think about innovation, we've got to have the latest new technology, or, you know, the greatest, you know, features for our clients or customers or members or stakeholders. But what's interesting, often those scores on innovation are low. And the reason is because employees cannot get what they simply think they can get, which is access to documents and information when they're traveling outside the office. The firewall, the virtual network, or whatever access they have is limited and restricted. So it really frustrates them. And we see innovation scores low for those organizations, for example. Just to touch on the last aspect of mobile, one of the things that we're doing is we're integrating some of our data and tools into some of our clients' mobile apps. So one of our clients is a large restaurant chain. They have a mobile app for their employees where they can access their timesheets, they can access their benefits and pay and time off, but they can also access and complete employee survey data and be part of a pulse process. So it allows us to collect data on a regular basis, both on the traditional PC environment, but also in a mobile environment where the younger workforce has moved towards. And that brings us to the last trend, Sharlyn.
Yeah, it does, which is about wellness. And you had mentioned a couple of times in your last comments, we were talking about employees getting frustrated. And I think it's important to understand that engaged employees are healthy employees. So when, you know, we talk about the workplace and some of the things that we've discussed today, you know, in terms of making sure that we have the best talent, making sure that we're using good processes, making sure that employees feel like they are working in the best space possible. It's important to address the wellness concept. And even if you don't have, although 80% of employers do offer some kind of wellness program, you don't have to offer a wellness program to encourage employees to take care of themselves, you know, practice self-care, and offer them some resources that they can use to manage themselves, particularly when we're talking about managers. I always say that I've never seen a stressed out manager with a really calm team, because we have to encourage a workplace where people will take care of themselves. Some benefits to developing a wellness program do include both flexibility in terms of, you know, physical, mental, financial well-being. So when we think about wellness and well-being, think about it in a high level, you know, not just physical wellness, but financial well-being is a really hot topic right now. In addition to that, think about where technology plays a role in this. You've got your Fitbit or your Apple Watch on that's tracking your steps, or you're closing your circles. Are there other wearables out there? Sean was talking about the app environment that he's created for customers. Are there other apps out there that will offer employees some things that they can focus on to be healthier and more well and less stressed. And Sean, I'm going to turn it over to you because I know you have some thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I guess I'm just going to wrap up here with sort of the last aspect around health and well-being. It certainly is an area that continues to grow in importance across different countries and around the world, keeping on this globalization concept. But it is different in different regions, and different things are important. But when we think about and get asked to add in additional sections into our core engagement survey and culture survey, as I mentioned earlier, corporate social responsibility is one area that we're often asked. Diversity and inclusion, growing workforce, different diverse workforce. And the third big area is health, wellness, and safety. That understanding of creating an environment where people can be not only productive through a good culture, but also healthy. And what we're doing now is helping organizations measure the health and wellness of the workplace and link that measurement back to not just engagement, but other indicators in the workplace that can either help improve safety, which is often an area that's important depending on your industry, or absenteeism, which can be more important in certain, government or nonprofit type of environment. And different things are important in different, but those three areas, corporate social responsibility, diversity, and health and wellness, are something that we're seeing more and more being implemented in our overall engagement and cultural surveys. And with that, I think what we should do, Sharlyn, is just sort of wrap up some of our thoughts here.
Terrific. We've talked about lots of different things today, trends and strategies to think about in not only the upcoming year, but the upcoming years ahead. So how do you make this happen within the organization? Well, first of all, consider today the start of your homework. As you can see, these issues are really complex. You're going to want to figure out how they impact your business. We saw from some of the polls today that some of the trends impact each organization just a little bit differently. So do your homework, figure out what makes the most sense for you to focus on, and then go out there and find that project sponsor. I know for me as a human resources professional, I would always go out and find that manager or that executive that was sort of the squeaky wheel all the time and was always pushing me to get something and say, okay, I want to do this and I want you to support me so that I can get the money in the budget and I can get the head count in order to make some stuff happen. Consider implementing pilot groups and a phased implementation. I do believe, and one of the reasons that I like the fact that we had Agile as part of our conversation today, I believe that today sometimes we can set ourselves up for failure by taking on too much. And so I recommend to people, consider developing a pilot group that can give you some feedback along the way, and also think about doing this in a phased, logical, methodical fashion so that you can roll things out. Take on a piece of the project, hit a home run, and then go ask for more. And then finally, measure results. And Sean, do you want me to handle measuring results, or would you like to jump in at this point in time? Because I know you've got a background in this.
Yeah, no, I'll just sort of wrap up. Yeah, I think the whole concept of, and that's in line with very much the Agile concept, is do something, do it quickly, get feedback, try it in a small pilot group, but also then use that feedback systematically to improve, whether they're pulse surveys, onboarding surveys, exit surveys as an example, or it might be more stay interviews or focus groups or discussion groups, ways to be able to actually assess whether or not what's working in your organization is resonating with your key audience, which are generally your employees out there. And maybe with that, Natalie, do you want to just sort of wrap up?
Yeah, sure, definitely. Thank you so much, Sean and Sharlyn. That was a great conversation. I definitely think that we could talk about this all day, but unfortunately we're over time, so I'm just going to wrap up with a couple of few things. So we talked about resources all throughout the presentation, so you can go to the TalentMap blog. We have a bunch of resources there. And then additionally, we've recently published a book, Employee Engagement and Action Planning for Dummies. So the book is free online, but there is a shipping charge. But there are little promo codes around the website. So if you find one, you can use that and the shipping fee will be waived. And then because we're extremely out of time right now, we'll skip the questions and then we'll email everyone who submitted one so they can get additional insights by email. And then one final note, the recording of the webinar and slide deck will be posted on the website, and we'll make sure to email you directly once it's available. And then we're also releasing an in-depth ebook with HR Bartender on this topic, so it will provide practical tools and strategies for your organization on the digital transformation in the workplace. So keep an eye out for that next month. And that is everything. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we hope you'll join us again soon.